Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Will to Power, and we are up to Section I, entitled The Thing in Itself and Appearance. 553. The foul blemish on Kant's criticism has at last become visible, even to the coarsest eyes. Kant had no right to his distinction, appearance, and thing in itself. In his own writings, he had deprived himself of the right of differentiating any longer in this old and hackneyed matter, seeing he had condemned the practice of drawing any conclusions concerning the cause of an appearance from the appearance itself, as unallowable in accordance with the conception of the idea of causality and its purely intraphenomenal validity. And this conception, on the other hand, already anticipates that differentiation, as if the thing in itself were not only inferred, but actually given. 554. It is obvious that neither things in themselves nor appearances can be related to each other in the form of cause and effect. And from this it follows that the concept cause and effect is not applicable in a philosophy which believes in things in themselves and in appearances. Kant's mistake, as a matter of fact from a psychological standpoint, the concept cause and effect is derived from an attitude of mind which believes it sees the action of will upon will everywhere, which believes only in living things and at bottom only in souls, not in things. Within the mechanical view of the world, which is logic in its application to space and time, that concept is reduced to the mathematical formula with which, and this is a fact which cannot be sufficiently emphasized, nothing is ever understood, but rather defined, deformed. 555. The greatest of all fables is the one relating to knowledge. People would like to know how things in themselves are constituted. But behold, there are no things in themselves. But even supposing there were an in itself, an unconditional thing, it could on that very account not be known. Something unconditioned cannot be known. Otherwise it would not be unconditioned. Knowing, however, is always a process of coming into relation with something. The knowledge seeker, on this principle, wants the thing which he would know to be nothing to him, and to be nothing to anybody at all. And from this there results a contradiction. In the first place, between this will to know and this desire that the thing to be known should be nothing to him. Wherefore know it all then? And secondly, because something which is nothing to anybody does not even exist, and therefore cannot be known. Knowing means to place oneself in relation with something, to feel oneself conditioned by something and oneself conditioning it under all circumstances. Then it is a process of making stable or fixed, of defining, of making conditions conscious, not a process of sounding things, creatures, or objects in themselves. 556. A thing in itself is just as absurd as a sense in itself, a meaning in itself. There is no such thing as a fact in itself, for a meaning must always be given to it before it become a fact. The answer to the question, what is that, is a process of fixing a meaning from a different standpoint. The essence, the essential factor, is something which is only seen as a whole in perspective, and which presupposes a basis which is multifarious. Fundamentally, the question is, what is that for me? For us, for everything that lives, etc., etc. A thing would be defined when all creatures had asked and answered this question, what is that, concerning it? Supposing that one single creature, with its own relations and standpoint in regard to all things, were lacking, that thing would still remain undefined. In short, the essence of a thing is really only an opinion concerning that thing. Or better still, quote, it is worth, end quote, is actually what is meant by, quote, it is, end quote, or by, quote, that is, end quote. One may not ask, who interprets then? For the act of interpreting itself as a form of the will to power manifests itself, not as being, but as a process, as becoming, as a passion. The origin of things is wholly the work of the idealizing, thinking, willing, and feeling subject. The concept thing as well as all its attributes. Even the subject is a creation of this order, a thing like all others. A simplification aiming at a definition of the power that fixes, invents, and thinks as such, as distinct from all isolated fixing, inventing, and thinking. Thus a capacity defined or distinct from all other individual capacities. At bottom, action conceived collectively in regard to all the action which has yet to come, action and the probability of similar action. 557. The qualities of a thing are its effects upon other things. If one imagines other things to be non-existent, a thing has no qualities. That is to say, there is nothing without other things. That is to say, there is no thing in itself. 558. The thing in itself is nonsense. If I think all the relations, all the qualities, all the activities of a thing away, the thing itself does not remain, for thingness was only invented fancifully by us to meet certain logical needs. That is to say, for the purposes of definition and comprehension, in order to correlate that multitude of relations, qualities, and activities. 559. Things which have a nature in themselves, a dogmatic idea which must be absolutely abandoned. 560. That things should have a nature in themselves, quite apart from interpretation and subjectivity, is a perfectly idle hypothesis. It would presuppose that interpretation and the act of being subjective are not essential, that a thing divorced from all its relations can still be a thing. Or, the other way round, the apparent objective character of things, might it not be merely the result of a difference of degree within the subject perceiving? Could not that be which changes slowly strike us as being objective, lasting, being in itself? Could not the objective view be only a false way of conceiving things and a contrast within the perceiving subject? 561. If all unity were only unity as organization, but the quote-unquote thing in which we believe was invented only as a substratum to the various attributes. If the thing quote-unquote acts, it means we regard all the other qualities which are to hand and which are momentarily latent as the cause accounting for the fact that one individual quality steps forward. That is to say, we take the sum of its qualities, X, as the cause of the quality X, which is obviously quite absurd and imbecile. All unity is only so in the form of organization and collective action, in the same way as a human community is a unity, that is to say, the reverse of atomic anarchy. Thus it is a body politic, which stands for one, yet is not one. 562. Quote, at some time in the development of thought, a point must have been reached when a man became conscious of the fact that what he called the qualities of a thing were merely the sensations of the feeling subject, and thus the qualities ceased from belonging to the thing. End quote. The quote-unquote thing in itself remained over. The distinction between the thing in itself and the thing for us is based upon that older and artless observation which would fain grant energy to things. But analysis revealed that even force was only ascribed to them by our fancy, as was also substance. Quote, the thing affects a subject. End quote. Thus, the root of the idea of substance is in language, not in things outside ourselves. The thing in itself is not a problem at all. Being will have to be conceived as a sensation which is no longer based upon anything quite devoid of sensation. In movement, no new meaning is given to feeling. That which is cannot be the substance of movement. It is therefore a form of being. In B, The explanation of life may be sought, in the first place, through mental images of the phenomena which precede it, purposes. Secondly, through mental images of phenomena which follow behind it, the mathematico-physical explanation. The two should not be confounded. Thus, the physical explanation, which is the symbolization of the world by means of feeling and thought, cannot in itself make feeling and thinking originate again and show its derivation. Physics must rather construct the world of feeling, consistently without feeling or purpose, right up to the highest man. And teleology is only a history of purposes, and is never physical. 563. Our method of acquiring quote-unquote knowledge is limited to a process of establishing quantities, but we can by no means help feeling the difference of quantity as differences of quality. Quality is merely a relative truth for us. It is not a thing in itself. Our senses have a certain definite quantum as a mean, within the limits of which they perform their functions. That is to say, we become conscious of bigness and smallness in accordance with the conditions of our existence. If we sharpened or blunted our senses tenfold, we should perish. That is to say, we feel even proportions as qualities in regard to our possibilities of existence. 564. But could not all quantities be merely tokens of qualities? Another consciousness and scale of desires must correspond a greater power, in fact, another point of view. Growth in itself is the expression of a desire to become more. The desire for a greater quantum springs from a certain quale. In a purely quantitative world, everything would be dead, stiff, and motionless. The reduction of all qualities to quantities is nonsense. It is discovered that they can only stand together. An analogy. 565. Qualities are our insurmountable barriers. We cannot possibly help feeling mere differences of quantity as something fundamentally different from quantity. That is to say, as qualities which we can no longer reduce to terms of quantity. But everything in regard to which the word knowledge has any sense at all belongs to the realm of reckoning, weighing, and measuring, to quantity, whereas, conversely, all our valuations, that is to say, our sensations, belong precisely to the realm of qualities, i.e., to those truths which belong to us alone and to our point of view, and which absolutely cannot be known. It is obvious that every one of us, different creatures, must feel different qualities, and must therefore live in a different world from the rest. Qualities are an idiosyncrasy proper to human nature. The demand that these, our human interpretations and values, should be general and perhaps real values, belongs to the hereditary madness of human pride. 566. The quote-unquote real world, in whatever form it has been conceived hitherto, was always the world of appearance over again. 567. The world of appearance, i.e., a world regarded in the light of values, ordered, selected according to values, that is to say, in this case, according to the standpoint of utility in regard to the preservation and the increase of power of a certain species of animal. It is the point of view, then, which accounts for the character of appearance, as if a world could remain over when the point of view is cancelled. By such means, relativity would also be cancelled. Every center of energy has its point of view of the whole of the remainder of the world. That is to say, its perfectly definite valuation, its mode of action, its mode of resistance. The, quote, world of appearance, end quote, is thus reduced to a specific kind of action on the world proceeding from a center. But there is no other kind of action, and the world is only a word for the collective play of these actions. Reality consists precisely in this particular action and reaction of every isolated factor against the whole. There no longer remains a shadow of a right to speak here of quote-unquote appearance. The specific way of reacting is the only way of reacting. We do not know how many kinds and what sorts of kinds there are. But there is no other, no real, no essential being, for thus a world without action and reaction would be expressed. The antithesis, world of appearance and real world, is thus reduced to the antitheses world and non-entity. 568. A criticism of the concept real and apparent world. Of these two, the first is a mere fiction, formed out of a host of imaginary things. Appearance itself belongs to reality. It is a form of its being, i.e., in a world where there is no such thing as being, a certain calculable world of identical cases must first be created through appearance, a tempo in which observation and comparison is possible, etc. Quote-unquote appearance is an adjusted and simplified world, in which our practical instincts have worked. For us it is perfectly true, for we live in it, we can live in it. This is the proof of its truth as far as we are concerned. The world, apart from the fact that we have to live in it, the world which we have not adjusted to our being, our logic, and our psychological prejudices, does not exist as a world in itself. It is essentially a world of relations. Under certain circumstances, it has a different aspect from every different point at which it is seen. It presses against every point, and every point resists it, and these collective relations are in every case incongruent. The measure of power determines what being possesses the other measure of power, under what form, force, or constraint it acts or resists. Our particular case is interesting enough. We have created a conception in order to be able to live in a world, in order to perceive just enough to enable us to endure life in that world. 569. The nature of our psychological vision is determined by the fact, 1. That communication is necessary, and that for communication to be possible, something must be stable, simplified, and capable of being stated precisely, above all in the so-called identical case. In order that it may be communicable, it must be felt as something adjusted, as recognizable. The material of the senses, arranged by the understanding, reduced to coarse, leading features, made similar to other things, and classified with its like. Thus, the indefiniteness of the chaos of sense impressions are, as it were, made logical. 2. The phenomenal world is the adjusted world which we believe to be real. Its reality lies in the constant return of similar, familiar, and related things, in their rationalized character, and in the belief that we are here able to reckon and determine. 3. The opposite of this phenomenal world is not the real world, but the amorphous and unadjustable world consisting of the chaos of sensations. That is to say, another kind of phenomenal world, a world which to us is unknowable. 4. The question how things in themselves are constituted, quite apart from our sense receptivity and the activity of our understanding, must be answered by the further question, how are we able to know that things existed? Thingness is one of our own inventions. The question is whether there are not a good many more ways of creating such a world of appearance, and whether this creating, rationalizing, adjusting, and falsifying be not the best guaranteed reality itself. In short, whether that which fixes the meaning of things is not the only reality, and whether the effect of environment upon us be not merely the result of such will-exercising subjects. The other creatures act upon us. Our adjusted world of appearance is an arrangement and an overpowering of its activities, a sort of defensive measure. The subject alone is demonstrable. The hypothesis might be advanced that subjects are all that exist, that object is only a form of action of subject upon subject, a modus of the subject. Section K. The Metaphysical Need. 570. If one resembles all the philosophers that have gone before, one can have no eyes for what has existed and what will exist. One only sees what is. But as there is no such thing as being, All that the philosophers had to deal with was a host of fancies. This was their quote-unquote world. 571. To assert the existence as a whole of things concerning which we know nothing, simply because there is an advantage in not being able to know anything of them, was a piece of artlessness on Kant's part, and the result of the recoil stroke of certain needs, especially in the realm of morals and metaphysics. 572. An artist cannot endure reality. He turns away or back from it. His earnest opinion is that the worth of a thing consists in that nebulous residue of it which one derives from color, form, sound, and thought. He believes that the more subtle, attenuated, and volatile a thing or a man becomes, the more valuable he becomes. The less real, the greater the worth. This is Platonism, but Plato was guilty of yet further audacity in the matter of turning tables. He measured the degree of reality according to the degree of value, and said, "The more there is of idea, the more there is of being." He twisted the concept reality round and said, "What ye regard as real is an error, and the nearer we get to the idea, the nearer we are to truth." Is this understood? It was the greatest of all rechristenings, and because Christianity adopted it, we are blind to its astounding features. At bottom, Plato, like the artist he was, placed appearance before being, and therefore lies and fiction before truth, unreality before actuality. He was, however, so convinced of the value of appearance that he granted it the attributes of being, causality, goodness, and truth, and in short, all those things which are associated with value. The concept value itself regarded as a cause. First standpoint. The ideal granted all attributes, conferring honor. Second standpoint. 573. The idea of the true world, or of God, as absolutely spiritual, intellectual, and good, is an emergency measure to the extent to which the antagonistic instincts are all-powerful. Moderation and existing humanity is reflected exactly in the humanization of the gods. The Greeks of the strongest period, who entertained no fear whatever of themselves, but on the contrary were pleased with themselves, brought down their gods to all their emotions. The spiritualization of the idea of God is thus very far from being a sign of progress. One is heartily conscious of this when one reads Goethe. In his works, the vaporization of God into virtue and spirit is felt as being upon a lower plane. 574. The nonsense of all metaphysics shown to the residue in the derivation of the conditioned out of the unconditioned. It belongs to the nature of thinking that it adds the unconditioned to the conditioned, that it invents it, just as it thought of and invented the ego to cover the multifariousness of its processes. It measures the world according to a host of self-devised measurements, according to its fundamental fictions. Quote, the unconditioned, end quote, end and means, things, substances, and according to logical laws, figures, and forms. There would be nothing which could be called knowledge if thought did not first so recreate the world into things which are in its own image. It is only through thought that there is untruth. The origin of thought, like that of feelings, cannot be traced, but is no proof of its primordiality or absoluteness. It simply shows that we cannot get behind it, because we have nothing else save thought and feeling. 575. To know is to point to past experience. In its nature, it is a regressus in infinitum, that which halts, in the face of so-called causa prima, or the unconditioned, etc., is laziness, weariness. 576. Concerning the psychology of metaphysics, the influence of fear. That which has been most feared, the cause of the greatest suffering, lust of power, voluptuousness, etc., has been treated with the greatest amount of hostility by men, and eliminated from the real world. Thus, the passions have been step by step struck out, God posited as the opposite of evil. That is to say, reality is conceived to be the negation of the passions and the emotions, i.e., non-entity. Irrationality, impulsive action, accidental action is, moreover, hated by them as the cause of incalculable suffering. Consequently, they denied this element in the absolute and interpreted it as absolute rationality and conformity of means to ends. Change and perishability were also feared, and by this fear an oppressed soul is revealed, full of distrust and painful experiences. The case with Spinoza, a man differently constituted would have regarded this change as a charm. A nature overflowing and playing with energy would be called precisely the passions, irrationality, and change, good in a eudaimonistic sense, together with their consequences, danger, contrast, ruin, etc. 577. Against the value of that which always remains the same, remember Spinoza's artlessness and Descartes' likewise, the value of the shortest and of the most perishable, the seductive flash of gold on the belly of the serpent Vita. 578. Moral values in an epistemology itself. The faith and reason, why not mistrust? The real world is the good world. Why? Appearance, change, contradiction, struggle, regarded as immoral. The desire for a world which knows nothing of these things. The transcendental world discovered, so that a place may be kept for moral freedom, as in Kant. Dialectics as the road to virtue, in Plato and Socrates, probably because sophistry was held to be the road to immorality. Time and space are ideal. Consequently, there is unity in the essence of things. Consequently, no sin, no evil, no imperfection, a justification of God. Epicurus denied the possibility of knowledge in order to keep the moral, particularly the hedonistic, values as the highest. Augustine does the same, and later Pascal, corrupted reason in favor of Christian values. Descartes' contempt for everything variable, likewise Spinoza's. 579. Concerning the psychology of metaphysics. This world is only apparent, therefore there must be a real world. This world is conditioned, consequently there must be an unconditional world. This world is contradictory, consequently there is a world free from contradiction. This world is evolving, consequently there is somewhat a static world. A host of false conclusions, blind faith in reason. If A exists, then its opposite B must also exist. Pain inspires these conclusions. At bottom they are wishes that such a world might exist. The hatred of a world which leads to suffering is likewise revealed by the fact that another and better world is imagined. The resentment of the metaphysician against reality is creative here. The second series of questions, wherefore suffer, and from this a conclusion is derived concerning the relation of the real world to our apparent, changing, suffering, and contradictory world. 1. Suffering as the consequence of error. How was error possible? 2. Suffering as the consequence of guilt. How was guilt possible? A host of experience drawn from the sphere of nature or society, universalized and made absolute. But if the conditioned world be causally determined by the unconditioned, then the freedom to err, to be sinful, must also be derived from the same quarter, and once more the question arises, to what purpose? The world of appearance, of becoming, of contradiction, of suffering is therefore willed. To what purpose? The error of these conclusions. Two contradictory concepts are formed, because one of them corresponds to a reality. The other must also correspond to a reality. Whence would one otherwise derive its contradictory concept? Reason is thus a source of revelation concerning the absolute. But the origin of the above contradictions need not necessarily be a supernatural source of reason. It is sufficient to oppose the real genesis of the concepts. This springs from practical spheres, from utilitarian spheres, hence the strong faith it commands. One is threatened with ruin if one's conclusions are not in conformity with this reason. But this fact is no proof of what the latter asserts. The preoccupation of metaphysicians with pain is quite artless. Eternal blessedness, psychological nonsense. Brave and creative men never make pleasure and pain ultimate questions. They are incidental conditions. Both of them must be desired when one will attain to something. It is a sign of fatigue and illness in these metaphysicians and religious men that they should press questions of pleasure and pain into the foreground. Even morality, in their eyes, derives its great importance only from the fact that it is regarded as an essential condition for abolishing pain. The same holds good of the preoccupation with the appearance and error, the cause of pain. A superstition that happiness and truth are related, confusion, happiness and certainty in faith. 580. To what extent are the various epistemological positions, materialism, sensualism, idealism, consequences of valuations? The source of the highest feelings of pleasure, feeling of value, may also judge concerning the problem of reality. The measure of positive knowledge is quite a matter of indifference and beside the point, as witness the development of indice. The Buddhistic negation of reality in general, appearance, pain, is perfectly consistent. Undemonstrability, inaccessibility, lack of categories not only for an absolute world, but a recognition of the erroneous procedures by means of which the whole concept has been reached. Absolute reality, being in itself, a contradiction. In a world of becoming, reality is merely a simplification for the purpose of practical ends, or a deception resulting from the coarseness of certain organs, or a variation in the tempo of becoming. The logical denial of the world and nihilism is a consequence of the fact that we must oppose nonentity with being, and that becoming is denied. Quote-unquote, something becomes. 581. Being and becoming. Quote-unquote, reason developed upon a sensualistic basis, upon the prejudices of the senses. That is to say, with the belief in the truth of the judgment of the senses. Quote-unquote, being, as the generalization of the concept life, breath, to be animate, to will, to act upon, become. The opposite is to be inanimate, not to become, not to will. Thus, being is not opposed to not being, to appearance, nor is it opposed to death, for only that can be dead which can also live. The soul, the ego, posited as primeval facts, and introduced wherever there is becoming. 582. Being, we have no other idea of it than that which we derive from living. How then can everything be dead? 583. A. I see with astonishment that science resigns itself today to the fate of being reduced to the world of appearance. We certainly have no organ of knowledge for the real world, be it what it may. At this point we may well ask, with what organ of knowledge is this contradiction established? The fact that a world which is accessible to our organs is also understood to be dependent upon these organs, and the fact that we should understand a world as subjectively conditioned, are no proofs of the actual possibility of an objective world. Who urges us to believe that subjectivity is real or essential? The absolute is even an absurd concept. An absolute mode of existence is nonsense. The concept being, thing, is always relative to us. The trouble is that, owing to the old antithesis apparent and real, the correlative valuations of little value and absolutely valuable have been spread abroad. The world of appearance does not strike us as a valuable world. Appearance is on a lower plane than the highest value. Only a real world can be absolutely valuable. Prejudice of prejudices. It is perfectly possible in itself that the real nature of things would be so unfriendly, so opposed to the first conditions of life, that appearance is necessary in order to make life possible. This is certainly the case in a large number of situations. For instance, marriage. Our empirical world would thus be conditioned, even in its limits, to knowledge by the instinct of self-preservation. We regard that as good, valuable, and true, which favors the preservation of the species. A. We have no categories which allow us to distinguish between a real and an apparent world. At the most, there could exist a world of appearance, but not our world of appearance. B. Taking the real world for granted, it might still be the less valuable to us, for the quantum of illusion might be of the highest order, owing to its value to us as a preservative measure. Unless appearance in itself were sufficient to condemn anything. C. That there exists a correlation between the degrees of value and the degrees of reality, so that the highest values also possess the greatest degree of reality, is a metaphysical postulate which starts out with the hypothesis that we know the order of rank among values, and that this order is a moral one. It is only on this hypothesis that truth is necessary as a definition of all that is of a superior value. B. It is of cardinal importance that the real world should be suppressed. It is of the most formidable inspirer of doubts and depredator of values concerning the world which we are. It was our most dangerous attempt heretofore on the life of life. War against all the hypotheses upon which a real world has been imagined. The notion that moral values are the highest values belongs to this hypothesis. The superiority of the moral valuation would be refuted if it could be shown to be the result of an immoral valuation, a specific case of real immorality. It would thus reduce itself to an appearance, and as an appearance it would cease from having any right to condemn appearance. C. Then the will to truth would have to be examined psychologically. It is not a moral power, but a form of the will to power. This would have to be proved by the fact that it avails itself of every immoral means there is, above all of the metaphysicians. At the present moment, we are face to face with the necessity of testing the assumption that moral values are the highest values. Method in research is attained only when all the moral prejudices have been overcome. It represents a conquest over morality. 584. The aberrations of philosophy are the outcome of the fact that, instead of recognizing in logic and the categories of reason merely a means to the adjustment of the world for utilitarian ends, that is to say, especially a useful falsification, they were taken to be the criterion of truth, particularly of reality. The criterion of truth was, as a matter of fact, merely the biological utility of a systematic falsification of this sort, on principle, and since a species of animals knows nothing more important than its own preservation, it was indeed allowable here to speak of truth. Where the artlessness came in, however, was in taking this anthropocentric idiosyncrasy as the measure of things, as the canon for recognizing the real and the unreal, in short, and making a relative thing absolute. And behold, all at once the world fell into the two halves, real and apparent. And precisely that world which man's reason had arranged for him to live and to settle in was discredited. Instead of using the forms as mere instruments for making the world manageable and calculable, the mad fancy of philosophers intervened, and saw that in these categories the concept that the world is given which does not correspond to the concept of the world in which man lives. The means were misunderstood as measures of value, and even used as a condemnation of their original purpose. The purpose was to deceive one's self in a useful way. The means thereto was the invention of forms and signs, with the help of which the confusing multifariousness of life could be reduced to a useful and wieldy scheme. But woe! A moral category was now brought into the game. No creature would deceive itself. No creature may deceive itself. Consequently, there is only a will to truth. What is truth? The principle of contradiction provided the scheme. The real world, to which the way is being sought, cannot be in contradiction with itself, cannot change, cannot evolve, has no beginning and no end. That is the greatest error which has ever been committed, the really fatal error of the world. It was believed that in these forms of reason a criterion of reality had been found, whereas their only purpose was to master reality by misunderstanding it intelligently. And behold, the world became false precisely owing to the qualities which constitute its reality, namely change, evolution, multifariousness, contrast, contradiction, war. And thenceforward the whole fatality was there. 1. How does one get rid of the false and merely apparent world? It was the real and only one. 2. How does one become oneself as remote as possible from the world of appearance? The concept of the perfect being as a contrast to the real being, or more correctly, as the contradiction of life. The whole direction of values was towards the slander of life. People deliberately confound ideal dogmatism with knowledge in general, so that the opposing parties also began to reject science with horror. Thus the road to science was doubly barred, first by the belief in the real world, and secondly by the opponents of this belief. Natural science and psychology were 1. Condemned in their objects, 2. Deprived of their artlessness. Everything is so absolutely bound and related to everything else in the real world that to condemn or to think away anything means to condemn and think away the whole. The words, "this should not be," "this ought not be," are a farce. If one imagines the consequences, one would ruin the very source of life by suppressing everything which is in any sense whatever dangerous or destructive. Physiology proves this much better. We see how morality, A, poisons the whole concept of the world, B, cuts off the way to science, C, dissipates and undermines all real instincts by teaching that their root is immoral. We thus perceive a terrible tool of decadence at work, which succeeds in remaining immune thanks to the holy names and holy attitudes it assumes. 585. The awful recovery of our consciousness, not of individual, but of the human species. Let us reflect. Let us think backwards. Let us follow the narrow and broad highway. A. Man seeks the truth, a world that does not contradict itself, that does not deceive, that does not change, a real world, a world in which there is no suffering, contradiction, deception, variability, the causes of suffering. He does not doubt that there is such a thing as a world as it ought to be. He would fain find a road to it. Indian criticism, even the ego is apparent and not real. Whence does man derive the concept of reality? Why does he make variability, deception, contradiction, the origin of suffering? Why not rather of his happiness? The contempt and hatred of all that perishes, changes, and varies. Whence comes this valuation of stability? Obviously, the will to truth is merely the longing for a stable world. The senses deceive. Reason corrects the errors. Therefore, it was concluded, reason is the road to a static state. The most spiritual ideas must be nearest to the quote-unquote real world. It is from the senses that the great numbers of misfortunes come. They are cheats, deluders, and destroyers. Happiness can be promised only by being. Change and happiness exclude each other. The loftiest desire is thus to be one with being. That is the formula for the way to happiness. In summa, the world as it ought to be exists. This world in which we live is an error. This our world should not exist. The belief in being shows itself only as a result. The real primum mobile is the disbelief in becoming, the mistrust of becoming, the scorn of all becoming. What kind of a man reflects in this way? An unfruitful, suffering kind, a world-weary kind. If we try and fancy what the opposite kind of man would be like, we have a picture of a creature who would not require the belief in being. He would rather despise it as dead, tedious and indifferent. The belief that the world which ought to be really exists is a belief proper to the unfruitful, who does not wish to create a world as it should be. They take it for granted. They seek for means and ways of attaining it. The will to truth is the impotence of the will to create. To recognize that something is thus or thus. To act so that something will be thus or thus. Antagonism in the degrees of energy in various natures. The fiction of a world which corresponds to our desires. Psychological artifices and interpretations calculated to associate all that we honor and regard as pleasant with this real world. The will to truth at this stage is essentially the art of interpretation, to which also belongs that interpretation which still possesses strength. The same species of men, grown 1 degree poorer, no longer possessed of the power to interpret and to create fictions, produces the nihilists. A nihilist is the man who says of the world as it is that it ought not to exist, and of the world as it ought to be that it does not exist. According to this, existence, action, suffering, willing, and feeling has no sense. The pathos of the in vain is the nihilist's pathos, and as pathos it is moreover an inconsistency on the part of the nihilist. He who is not able to introduce his will into things, the man without either will or energy, at least invests them with some meaning, i.e., he believes that a will is already in them. The degree of a man's willpower may be measured from the extent to which he can dispense with the meaning in things, from the extent to which he is able to endure a world without meaning, because he himself arranges a small portion of it. The philosophical objective view of things may thus be a sign of poverty, both of will and of energy. For energy organizes what is closest and next. The quote-unquote scientists, whose only desire is to ascertain what exists, are such as cannot arrange things as they ought to be. The artists, an intermediary species, they at least set up a symbol of what should exist. They are productive inasmuch as they actually alter and transform, not like the scientists who leave everything as it is. The connection between philosophers and the pessimistic religions, the same species of man, they attribute the highest degree of reality to the things which are valued highest. The connection between philosophers and moral men and their evaluations, the moral interpretation of the world as the sense of the world, after the collapse of the religious sense. The overcoming of philosophers by the annihilation of the world of being, intermediary period of nihilism, before there is sufficient strength present to transvalue values and to make the world of becoming and of appearance the only world to be deified and called good. B. Nihilism as a normal phenomenon may be a symptom of increasing strength or of increasing weakness, partly owing to the fact that the strength to create and to will has grown to such an extent that it no longer requires this collective interpretation and introduction of a sense, present duties, state, etc. Partly owing to the fact that even the creative power necessary to invent sense declines, and disappointment becomes the ruling condition. The inability to believe in a sense becomes unbelief. What is the meaning of science in regard to both possibilities? 1. It is a sign of strength and of self-control. It shows an ability to dispense with healing, consoling words of illusion. 2. It is also able to undermine, to dissect, to disappoint, and to weaken. C. The belief in truth, the need of holding to something which is believed to be true, psychological reduction apart from the valuations that have existed hitherto, fear and laziness. At the same time, unbelief, reduction. In what way does it acquire a new value, if a real world does not exist at all? By this means the capacity of valuing, which hitherto has been lavished upon the world of being, becomes free once more. 586. The real and the apparent world. A. The erroneous concepts which proceed from this concept are of three kinds. A. An unknown world. We are adventurers, we are inquisitive. That which is known to us makes us weary. The danger of the concept lies in the fact it suggests that this world is known to us. B. Another world where things are different. Something in us draws comparisons, and thereby our calm submission and our silence lose their value. Perhaps all will be for the best. We have not hoped in vain. The world where things are different, who knows? Where we ourselves will be different. C. A real world. That is the most singular blow and attack which we have ever received. So many things have become encrusted in the word true, that we involuntarily give these to the real world. The real world must also be a truthful world, such a one as would not deceive us or make fools of us. To believe in it in this way is to be almost forced to believe, from convention, as is the case among people worthy of confidence. The concept, the unknown world, suggests that this world as known to us is tedious. The concept, the other world, suggests that this world might be different. It suppresses necessity and fate. It is useless to submit and to adapt oneself. The concept, the true world, suggests that this world is untruthful, deceitful, dishonest, not genuine, and not essential, and consequently not a world calculated to be useful to us. It is unadvisable to become adapted to it. Better to resist it. Thus we escape from this world in three different ways. A. With our curiosity, as though the interesting part was somewhere else. B. With our submission, as though it was not necessary to submit, as though this world was not an ultimate necessity. C. With our sympathy and respect, as though this world did not deserve them, as though it was mean and dishonest towards us. In summa, we have become revolutionaries in three different ways. We have made X our criticism of the quote-unquote known world. B. The first step to reason. To understand to what extent we have been seduced, for it might be precisely the reverse. A. The unknown world could be so constituted as to give us a liking for this world. It may be a more stupid and meaner form of existence. B. The other world, very far from taking account of our desires, which were never realized here, might be part of the mass of things which this world makes possible for us. To learn to know this world would be a means of satisfying us. C. The true world. But who actually says that the apparent world must be of less value than the true world? Do not our instincts contradict this judgment? Is not man eternally occupied in creating an imaginative world, because he will have a better world than reality? In the first place, how do we know that our world is not the true world? For it might be that the other world is the world of appearance. As a matter of fact, the Greeks, for instance, actually imagined a region of shadows, a life of appearance, beside real existence. And finally, what right have we to establish degrees of reality, as it were? That is something different from an unknown world. That is already the will to know something of the unknown. The other, the unknown world, good. But to speak of the true world is as good as knowing something about it. That is the contrary of the assumption of an X world. In short, the world X might be in every way a more tedious, a more inhuman, and a less dignified world than this one. It would be quite another matter if it were assumed that there were several X worlds, that is to say, every possible kind of world besides our own, but this has never been assumed. C. Problem. Why has the image of the other world always been to the disadvantage of this one? That is to say, always stood as a criticism of it. What does this point to? A people that are proud of themselves and who are on the ascending path of life always picture another existence as lower and less valuable than theirs. They regard the strange unknown world as their enemy, as their opposite. They feel no curiosity, but rather repugnance in regard to what is strange to them. Such a body of men would never admit that another people were the true people. The very fact that such a distinction is possible, that this world should be called the world of appearance, and that the other should be called the true world, is symptomatic. The places of origin of the idea of another world. The philosopher who invents a rational world where reason and logical functions are adequate, this is the root of the true world. The religious man who invents a divine world, this is the root of the denaturalized and the anti-natural world. The moral man who invents a free world, this is the root of the good, the perfect, the just, and the holy world. The common factor in the three places of origin: psychological error, physiological confusion. With what attributes is the other world, as it actually appears in history, characterized? With the stigmata of philosophical, religious, and moral prejudices. The other world, as it appears in the light of these facts, is synonymous with not being, with not living, with the will not to live. General aspect. It was the instinct of the fatigue of living, and not that of life, which created the other world. Result. Philosophy, religion, and morality are symptoms of decadence. Section L. The biological value of knowledge. It might seem as though I had evaded the question concerning certainty. The reverse is true, but while raising the question of the criterion of certainty, I wished to discover the weights and measures with which men had weighed heretofore, and to show that the question concerning certainty is already in itself a dependent question, a question of the second rank. 588. The question of values is more fundamental than the question of certainty. The latter only becomes serious once the question of values has been answered. Being and appearance, regarded psychologically, yield no being in itself, no criterion for reality, but only degrees of appearance, measured according to the strength of the sympathy which we feel for appearance. There is no struggle for existence between ideas and observations, but only a struggle for supremacy. The vanquished idea is not annihilated, but only driven to the background or subordinated. There is no such thing as annihilation in intellectual spheres. 589. End and means, cause and effect, subject and object, action and suffering, thing in itself and appearance. As interpretations, not as established facts, and in what respect were they perhaps necessary interpretations? As preservative measures, all in the sense of a will to power. 590. Our values are interpreted into the heart of things. Is there, then, any sense in the absolute? Is not sense necessarily relative sense and perspective? All sense is will to power. All relative senses may be identified with it. 591. The desire for established facts, epistemology. How much pessimism there is in it. 592. The antagonism between the quote-unquote true world, as pessimism depicts it, and a world in which it were possible to live. For this, the rights of truth must be tested. It is necessary to measure all these quote-unquote ideal forces according to the standard of life, in order to understand the nature of that antagonism, the struggle of sickly, desperate life cleaving to a beyond against healthier, more foolish, more false, richer and fresher life. Thus it is not quote-unquote truth struggling with life, but one kind of life with another kind. But the former would fain be the higher kind. Here we must prove that some order of rank is necessary, that the first problem is the order of rank among kinds of life. 593. The belief, quote, "it is thus and thus," quote, must be altered into the will, quote, "thus and thus shall it be," quote. This is the end of Part 3 of Volumes 3 and 4 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.